Fantastic, John. I appreciate that very much. And let me add my own welcome to your welcome to everyone on board today. And let me tell you at the outset, probably the most important thing I'll say in the day, and that is that each and every one of us has only one and only one utterly unrenewable and precious resource. And that in truth is our time. It's the one thing we can't recover, we can't generate more of. So in the short period of time we have today, 2 hours, I assure you we will make the best use of that time that we possibly can. I want to respect the time we have and make sure that this training provides maximum utility and application to the world of work that you're engaged in. So let me just make sure to underscore at the outset that you can feel free to ask anything you want at any point. Not a problem. This is all about you and trying to adapt this material and modify it to make sure that it meets your needs diagnostically. We're going, of course, to be talking about diagnostic developments in the DSM-5-TR, a deeper dive, the riveting topic of psychodiagnosis. But I assure you that we will take the deep dive, but I will bring you back to the surface, hopefully without need for decompression, the painful experience of the bends, and we'll be able to circumnavigate a fair amount of the changes in the DSM-5-TR, which are in fact fairly robust, the title, text revision notwithstanding. It's important to recognize at the outset that the DSM-5-TR, or text revision, which just came out last year, is scabbed onto, it's built onto, it's added to, it's a revision of the DSM-5 that functionally now is 10 years old. So it is an extreme makeover, in a sense, of an existing edifice, the DSM-5. It contains, of course, the ICD-10 CM, or clinical modification. That's the modification of the ICD-10 codes made by the United States of America. It contains the ICD-10 CM codes, but those codes themselves are predicated on the ICD-10 codes that came out in 1990. So I want to acknowledge a central tension that's built in from the get-go in the DSM-5-TR. So recognize, we're going to return to this. You're going to hear it probably ad nauseum. But what we are dealing with DSM-5-TR is something old and something new. Something old, the ICD-10 CM codes, 1990, that's 33 years ago, and something new, the DSM-5-TR. So in a sense, the chassis, the shiny, bright chassis of the DSM-5-TR is in fact quite contemporary, quite new, but the engine beneath that vehicle is actually a little aged. If you think about the world of psychodiagnosis back in 1990, you'll recognize the changes that have occurred in the intervening years between then and now. It's a theme we'll return to. So let me just say that by way of starting, that if you, like me, have been around the world of psychodiagnosis for some period of time, regardless of how long of tooth you are, you'll recognize that we've undergone significant changes in pretty short periods of time. It wasn't that long ago that we were using the ICD-9 codes in the DSM-4 and DSM-4-TR. Don't forget, the ICD-9 codes, there were only 15,000 of them across all of medicine, were penned in 1974. We were using those all the way up until midstream in the DSM-5. So we were using the ICD-9 codes in the DSM-4 and 4-TR. 5 comes out. 5 contained both the ICD-9 codes and the 10 codes. And another theme that we will return to, because it had to articulate with what was and what will be. We hadn't yet adopted a new code structure, the ICD-10 code structure, so that when the DSM-5 came out, it had to contain the old codes. That was those dark, bold black on the upper left-hand side of each of the diagnostic categories. Unipolar depression, 296.21, 22, 23. And the ICD-10, the newly minted ICD-10 CM codes, which are those screen back F codes that we're now so familiar with. Both of those were in the DSM-5. And then we adopted the ICD-10 CM code structure, and that is what the DSM-5-TR contains. It no longer contains any of the codes from the ICD-9. It's only the ICD-10 CM. Today, of course, we're going to be talking pretty exclusively about the DSM-5-TR, or text revision. But it's really important to keep in mind that when you talk about the DSM-5 PR, you have to talk about the ICD-10-CM, or clinical modification, because that's the codes that are in the DSM-5 TR. And you have to talk about the ICD-11, which we in the United States have not yet adopted, but much of the world has. The rest of the world surely will. And it had a significant impact on the changes, as we'll see, in the DSM-5 TR. So it almost exerted a gravitational force, an unrelenting gravitational force that the DSM-5 had to yield to as it made its revisions, or its text revision, DSM-5 text revision. So let me ask you, let's start with a poll. And let me ask you that regardless of when you started your first exposure to the DSM panoply of psychopathology, whether you started in DSM-1 or DSM-5 TR, how familiar are you with the current version, with the DSM-5 TR? And so let's go ahead and open this poll. A, B, C, or D. A, I am very familiar, or I've read the DSM-5 TR from cover to cover, so much so that I could conduct this training myself, but I just don't want to. Or B, I'm somewhat familiar. I've read about most, if not all, of the changes. I just want a deeper dive, a more comprehensive coverage. C, I've heard bits and pieces here and there, not much else. Or D, I am genuinely clueless. If I've heard anything at all, I honestly can't recall a single word of it. So if you would take a second and just indicate your level of familiarity with the DSM-5 TR, the current version of the DSM-5. And then give it a minute, let people record their responses, and then we'll get a sense of where people stand at this point. Mindful that it's oftentimes difficult for people to acknowledge, but the truth of the matter is the market penetration in psychology and in related mental health field for the development of new things, whether they're interventions or pharmacologies or diagnostic changes, is actually quite long. It's 7 to 8 years from the time something is invented, created, approved, authorized, or whatever, to the time it actually penetrates the marketplace of users, providers begin to use it, the market absorbs it, and we begin attending to and utilizing it, is oftentimes 7 or 8 years. So at this point, we're all still early adopters in relation to the DSM-5 ER. So we can go ahead and show the results whenever you want to, John. And I've got a peculiar overlay over if you are showing the results now, I've got a peculiar overlay over my bar graph, so I can't actually read it. It looks to me like about 160 of the nearly 300 of us have responded, and the time's expired, but I actually can't see the results. Let me see. No, because I've got, again, a peculiar overlay over that. So you're going to have to override me, John, and pull up those results or just read them out for folks.
Sure. It looks like we have 1% that selected the letter A. Looks like we have a little over 20% that selected letter B, as well as a little more over 20% letter C. And it looks like about 10% selected letter D.
Okay, good. Okay, so we're crudely normally distributed, and that's kind of what I might expect. And for those of you who answered D, this is what I call candor among colleagues, being genuinely clueless. There was every reason in the world to be genuinely clueless at this point, but it sounds like the mode is sort of in that B and C category, and that's fantastic. Again, it takes a while for these changes to get acknowledged and absorbed within the field. And of course, we have none of the hoopla around the DSM-5 TR that we had around the DSM-5, which many people regard as the single greatest or the second only to DSM-3 most robust change in the history of the panoply of psychopathology that the DSM represents. So DSM-5 TR doesn't have the fanfare, doesn't have the marquee position that the DSM-5 enjoyed. So I think its uptake in general is going to be slower. So it gives us a sense, a level setting about where people stand at this point. Very helpful, very useful. Let me just say a couple things by way of disclaimer, and that is that, obviously I'm going to be expressing my views and opinions. I'm happy to do that at every point that I can. I'm going to remain tried and true in relation to the factual revisions and changes of the DSM. I have no problem at all sharing with you my perception of what those changes mean in terms of good, bad, or the ugly, but I also don't own any special insider knowledge in relation to those changes and the value of them. Quite literally, one person's treasure is another person's trash. Something that could be quite useful in one context to one person might be just the opposite for somebody else. So please be aware that there's nothing sacrosanct about my particular opinion. In our limited time, we're going to be able to talk about certainly all of the major changes in the DSM-5. There will be some specialty practice area changes that we won't be able to talk about. If your specialty is in sleep disorders, for example, we're not going to be concentrating on the difference between cataplectic and non-cataplectic narcolepsy. That gets into too granular of a consideration. But the majority of the changes, definitely conceptual as well as empirical, we'll be able to talk about, and the additions and revisions, no problem. We should be able to circumnavigate that. Again, feel free at any point to ask any questions you'd like to. I'm absolutely happy to respond to any interest that you may have. It's important to recognize that as we talk today, I am not representing the American Psychiatric Association. They are the proprietors, the owners of the DSM-5 TR. It is a proprietary diagnostic system. They do own it. It is revenue generating. I have no revenue that I receive from the DSM or the American Psychiatric Association. And likewise, although, as John pointed out, I'm employed by the American Psychological Association, the other APA, I'm actually not representing the American Psychological Association. For those of you who are familiar with it, the American Psychological Association is sort of an honest broker when it comes to psychodiagnostic systems. What they say is, we're not throwing in with the DSM, we're not throwing in with the ICD, we're not throwing in with the psychodynamic diagnostic manual. We just want providers to be comfortable and competent in relation to whatever diagnostic system they use. So they kind of maintain, they're Switzerland. They maintain a position of neutrality in relation to psychodiagnostic systems. And so I'm not a mouthpiece for either the American Psychiatric Association or the American Psychological Association. And obviously, I'm not representing the World Health Organization that runs the ICD, International Classification of Diseases. I have no proprietary or commercial interest whatsoever. And anything that we talk about today, including my slide set and so forth, are all open access, or I have express written permission for you to use them. So if you find anything that we're talking about to be useful in your own practice or supervision or training, by all means, feel free to use it. The whole point is to get the information out there and, to get people trained up as effectively and efficiently as we can. There are really no risks or limitations that I can see in the presentation. We will look at a clinical video in a little bit. If you're clinical practitioners, I think what you will see in the video is not dramatic or traumatic compared to the kinds of things you may well see on a regular basis. But on the other hand, it is clinical material, and it just will forewarn you. It has to do with non-suicidal self-injury. So just to let you know. But beyond that, I think this is pretty safe territory. I want to emphasize the fact, again, that we all bring perspectives. I'm happy to share mine. There's absolutely nothing sacrosanct about it. If your position or perspective is different from mine, you will find me very much affirming and embracing it, because as far as I can tell, none of us has a corner on the truth market when it comes to psychodiagnosis. Well, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the DSM-5 TR. Who, what, when, where, why at the outset. That's the elevator speech version of the changes in DSM-5 TR. So you can understand the context or background in a Reader's Digest condensed version of what the changes are. Then we're going to talk about the dual or dueling diagnostic systems, because the truth is that the ICD and the DSM have a long history. They have a relationship, and like any other relationship with a history, that means it has ups and it has downs. While the two diagnostic systems, I think it's fair to say, sleep together peaceably, they do so with one eye open. We will talk about the relationship between those two diagnostic documents that, in fact, are increasingly harmonized. And that's the magic term that both the APA and the World Health Organization use. They are not isomorphic. They are not the same. They're not even close, but they try to articulate with one another. They try to harmonize. On the other hand, if these two members were the member of the same barbershop quartet, you would not detect tremendous harmony. You would experience periodic cacophony, and that's what we will see. There are points of convergence, yes, absolutely, and there are points of divergence, and we'll take a look at some of both of those today. Mostly, we're going to spend our time, though, on quote unquote new disorders in the DSM 5 TR. They're not all new disorders per se, so you can put those in what the Brits would call scare quotes. We would say quotation marks. But some of them are, like prolonged grief disorders. Some of them are resurrected disorders, like unspecified mood disorders. They were here, they were gone, now they're back. Others are not disorders per se that are standalone, freestanding, coded diagnostic categories, but they are diagnostic codes that can be applied, but again, not standalone approved Section 2 disorders like suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury. And then we want to reserve time for sure to talk about culturally sensitive and affirming changes in the DSM-5 TR, because honestly, when the dust settles, when the music stops, at the end of the day, when we look back at the DSM-5 TR, I actually think that the majority of what we will see as its lasting contribution will have to do with what I regard as its sea change in relation to the direction of in the treatment of aspects of no racial considerations, cultural more broadly. Yes, it introduces some new things. Yes, it changes some new things. And there are some important revisions. But I think the big change is the subtle one. The big change is the nuanced one. The big change is, if you will, in the latent rather than manifest aspects of the DSM-5 TR. That has to do with its attention to issues, qualitatively different attention to issues of culture. So we have to pause and say something about that before we conclude with, in the immortal words of Buzz Lightyear, to infinity and beyond. Now that we are where we are with the DSM-5 TR and the ICD-10/11, where do we go next? What are the future directions for those two diagnostic systems, either independently or interdependently? So we'll say a few words about that as well. So let's turn to look at the who, what, when, where, and why of the DSM-5 TR. Well, the who is pretty clear. It is Michael First. Michael, I love this. Michael B. First. It sounds like a musical group. Michael B. First. Will I Am. Michael B. First. For those of you who know Michael First, you know he's a DSM devotee. He was around a long time. He was the editor, not the task force chair, but the editor of the DSM-4 and DSM-4 TR. So he's been around a long time. He's kind of a protege, if you will, of Al Francis. He's a psychiatrist. He had his master's training in Carnegie Mellon, actually, in computer science engineering, and then went on to Pittsburgh and got his medical degree. Kind of an epidemiologist sort of guy. He's definitely an inside baseball guy, no doubt about it. He was joined by Philip Wang, well-respected MD and psychiatrist, as a co-chair of the DSM-5 TR. Of course, they were joined by lots of other people. They had a couple of vice chairs, for example, and then they had 200 subject matter experts that joined them in making the revisions. Now, a lot has been made about the greater inclusiveness in terms of adding a broader chorus of voices to the revision of the DSM and the DSM-5 TR. And that's kind of true and kind of not true. And so what I thought I'd do is just show you the data on this. Because the way the story goes is that the circle has widened and there's been considerably greater inclusiveness of different variety of voices in the revision. It isn't as insular or siloed as it used to be. But here's a comparison of the DSM-5 and 5 TR in terms of the kinds of professionals, the professional groups whose voices were included in the revisions. On the left, you'll see the bar chart is the composition of the DSM-5, and on the right, the DSM-5 TR. Well, you can see that in the DSM-5, on the left, about 63% of the people involved in making the changes, this is the work group task force, about 63% were psychiatrists, about 30% were psychologists, and about 8% were other, principally social workers, but also marriage and family, licensed mental health counselors, and so forth. If you move over to the DSM-5 TR, you can see that the psychiatrists have been notched down from about 63% to about 60%, so they lost, if you will, 3%. Psychologists were notched down from about 30% to about 25%, And then that difference, that 8 or 9%, whatever it is, got added over into the other group to increase the diversity of different perspectives. So this is one of those things where you just have to ask yourself, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? Does that represent a significant change in the composition of the voices, the choir, if you will, that's singing for the revisions of the DSM? Well, that's kind of it's in the eye of the beholder. In my view, it does represent an undeniable move toward greater inclusiveness, but I would not regard that as a sea change. I would regard that as an incremental change. So just so you get a sense of, if you hear that in the literature, you read about that, you get a sense of what the composition of the changers, the task force members and work group members actually look like with the DSM-5 TR. What about the what? Well, this is really where the rubber meets the road. What's in the DSM-5 that's new? Well, there are new disorders. Prolonged grief disorder, we'll talk about for sure. They added stimulant-induced mild neurocog under the neurocognitive disorders. Stimulant-induced wasn't in there before, but there's sufficient research now that warrants the inclusion of that as a standalone disorder. There are some resurrected disorders that we'll talk about. Unspecified mood disorder is one of them. There are some conceptually revised disorders, majorly revised. Gender dysphoria has changed to some extent. Dysthymia absolutely has changed tremendously. There's some new codes, and I alluded to that. These are not disorders per se, but they are new codes that can be applied to disorders. And principally here, we're talking about suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-injury, and we'll look at instances of both of those. There were about 70 overall revisions in criteriological sets. I think I could characterize those as ranging from the lofty to the sublime. Frankly, many of them are what I would regard as editorial changes or points of clarification, but they nonetheless, a few of them are significant. And so it's important to keep in mind that there are criteriological revisions as well that change the nature. When you change the criteria, you're changing obviously the nature of the disorder itself. If the way in which it gets diagnosed becomes more or less stringent, it affects, for example, prevalence rates. When you enhance the stringentness of a diagnostic category, the criteria, you reduce the prevalence rate, and when you make them more relaxed, bring the stringency down, obviously the prevalence rates go up. So you can see the relationship between the criteriological changes and prevalence rates as one instance. And then, of course, I've already alluded to what I regard as a extreme cultural makeover in the DSM-5 TR. We'll talk about that as well. When? Well, the when for the DSMs is 5 TR is pretty straightforward. I mean, functionally, for all practical purposes, the DSM-5 TR began the moment the DSM-5 launched. Because as soon as it launched, as you know, there was a cascade of errata and changes, lots of things that were mistakes. In fact, there was a huge controversy about the DSM-5 rushing to print, so much so that some people, as you know, quit the task force, the work groups rather, because they felt it was irresponsible to privilege the publication date and the commercial interests over the scientific and clinical. They thought it should marinate a bit longer and be more complete and responsible. Well, they didn't. They rushed to print. Lots of changes, lots of concerns, and then all those errata sheets that came out after the DSM-5 launched in 2013. Well, all of those changes, everything that happened from the moment of the printing of the DSM-5 to today, all of that has been brought into the DSM-5 TR. So practical purposes, functionally, the DSM-5 TR began the moment the DSM-5 published. Officially, though, they appointed the work groups in 2019. They worked, a bevy of these 200 and some people, for about 3 years. They launched the document officially, of course, as you know, in March of 2022, a year ago. The changes in the DSM-5 TR are principally to incorporate the literature over the last decade. Why the last decade? Well, because basically it's been a decade since the DSM-5 launched. So they really privileged and concentrated on adding in and attending to revisions, changes, and advances, both in terms of the empirical literature within the professions, the allied health professions, but also the conceptual and sociological, sociocultural changes that have occurred within the broader field society in which we live. And a lot has happened in the last decade, as you well know. So that's the win. the why and why now? Well, this is an interesting point. Why now? Why the DSM-5 TR and why now? Well, at the manifest level, and probably the most compelling and straightforward response to that is, well, because it's been a decade. Hey, look, a lot's happened. In 10 years, think about it. Think about your area of specialty practice, whatever that might be. Think about the conceptual changes that have occurred in the last decade. Think about the empirical advances, hallmark watershed moments of empirical research that have advanced the literature, whether that's in psychopharmacology or forensic psychology or health psychology or pediatric psychology or neuropsych. Wow, if you're practicing on the basis of what you knew 10 years ago, you're probably a troglodyte, right? So a lot has happened. But the big thing, or a big thing in addition, is the sociocultural changes. Because if you think about it, 10 years ago was before the Me Too movement. It was before the racial reckoning. It was before COVID, obviously. And all of those things have rocked our world. So when a diagnostic system changes, when it evolves, and it does represent an evolution, it has to articulate not only with changes within the field, that is empirical advances within psychology, social work, medicine, etc., pharmacology, neurology, and so forth, but also within the broader culture, has to articulate with the cultural changes, cultural sensitivities that themselves evolve. It's called the evolution of social consciousness. And the DSM has not always been finely attuned to sociocultural evolution, but I think the DSM-5 is starting to be a little bit more attentive, as we'll see. So that's kind of why now. Also, the DSM, not to be lost in this discussion, the DSM-5 TR is kind of now because it kind of has to be now. Why does it kind of have to be now? Well, because the World Health Organization did launch the ICD-11. The United States has not adopted the ICD-11 yet, but the world launched the ICD-11. So if the DSM is going to stay in pace, it's got to come up with something new. It can't have something from 2013 competing with something from 2022. So it has to, in a sense, play catch up, as we will see. And then finally, in terms of the why now, is the name of the manual itself, the revision. Why is the DSM-5 TR or text revision called the DSM-5 TR, text revision, and not the DSM 5.1 or DSM 5R or DSM 6? Well, this is, I mean, we could have an hour-long discussion about this alone, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of that. It's called the TR or text revision, revision, and not the DSM 5.1. And that's in a sense odd because you remember the whole reason that the DSM-5 went to 5, that is using an Arabic numeral instead of a Roman numeral. All the previous DSMs were Roman numerals. 1, 2, 3, 3R, 4, 4, TR were all Roman numerals. DSM-5 introduced the Arabic numeral, that is 5, like this. Okay? They did that because they were going to come up with micro revisions. They were going to come up with 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, just like your Microsoft, software might. They didn't do that. They had to go to Arabic numerals if they were going to do what was called the micro revisions, because if you didn't and you had a DSM-5 in Roman numerals, and it was a 5.1 from a distance, what's that going to look like? It's going to look a lot like a DSM-6, isn't it? And by the time you get to a DSM 11.9 in Roman numerals, that's going to look like a hieroglyphic. Okay, it's going to be uninterpretable. So they had to go to Arabic numerals, DSM-5. However, they decided not to do the micro editions. DSM-5 TR is DSM-5 TR. It is not the DSM 5.1. Why has, it's a great question, the United States not yet adopted ICD-11? Okay, and let me speak to that 1 second. So they didn't do the micro revisions. They didn't do the micro revisions because they waited too dadgum long. Because the idea of a micro revision is every 2 or 3 years or 4 years, you would just infuse the manual with the latest and greatest research knowledge. Okay, but they waited 9 years. And by 9 years, you're not in micro territory anymore. You're in macro territory. So you have to have something more substantial. Plus, I'm just being honest. Nobody had, after the falderall that the DSM-5 represented, it was a lot of work, a tremendous amount of controversy. Nobody was anxious to get back in the room and do a revision. So 9 years later, okay, the passage of time, the trauma has passed. Some people were willing to come back and work on a revision. So that's why it couldn't be a 5.1. It had to be a 5 something else. Could it be a 6? No, it can't be a 6 because, as we'll see, you can only come up with a whole new edition of the DSM when it articulates with a new ICD, because the DSM, as we'll see, is a derivative of the ICD. The World Health Organization will not allow the American Psychiatric Association to come up with a new edition. That's why the DSM-3R was a revision, not the DSM-4. It was called the DSM-3R because there was no ICD coming out at that time for them to articulate with. It's the same thing with the DSM-5TR. There's no new version. The DSM-5 articulated with the ICD-11. DSM-5TR has no new addition to it to articulate with. So it wasn't allowed to be called a DSM-6. It's not until the ICD gets revised in ICD-12 that we'll have a DSM-6. Well, why didn't they call it the DSM-R, 5R? Well, they could have. In the history of the DSM, as you know, there's only one TR and one R. There's a DSM-3R in 1980, and there's a DSM-4TR text revision. Well, I think you can call the DSM-5 TR midway between a TR and an R. Maybe it's not as R-ish as an R, but, because the R was actually a lot of change. There were big changes in the DSM-3R. So probably these changes aren't as big as the R, but they're surely bigger than the TR, the 4TR. So they're kind of quick in between. Think of it as the DSM-5 TR squared. Or on steroids, DSM-5TR on steroids. Let's call that. It's more than a text revision, I assure you. Why did the United States not move to the ICD-11? Well, there are two simple reasons: money and money, or maybe money and time. It cost, who knows? Some people's estimates are in the $60 billion category to make the transition from the ICD 9 to 10 codes. We were moving, of course, from 15,000 to nearly 60,000 codes across all of conditions, not just psychology or psychiatry, but all health conditions. And in the United States, unlike every other post-industrial country, save one, there's one system that rivals our own in post-industrial society that is a non-socialist system, let's say, of medicine, and that's South Africa. But every other post-industrial nation has a form of socialized medicine. So when you make a change, you have one gigantic lever, and the government pulls that lever, and the government largely bears the costs of pulling that lever. Well, in the United States, when you change every electronic health record from ICD-9 codes to 10, or from 10 to 11, the individual payer has to absorb tremendous costs. And that's everything from the Hospital Corp of America down to the mom and pop pediatrician. So it took forever, it was very complex, it was very expensive. And so nobody had a stomach for going to the ICD-11 now. Probably, there's no doubt we're going, because we, the United States, are a charter member. Remember the World Health Organization? Remember United Nations? United Nations, the World Health Organization comes under the auspices of the United Nations. And we're charter members of the United Nations, like we helped create it. So we're like card-carrying, authentic members. We don't have any choice. We are obligated by virtue of being members, together with about 200 countries of the United Nations, to use the ICD-11. There's no doubt about that. It's just that we have the prerogative to define the timeline under which we do the adoption. Probably, I am not Greg Nostradamus Niemeyer gang, so please don't hold me to this, but I strongly suspect that we will not do in the DSM-11 what we did in the DSM-10. I don't think we're going to have a single moment that we flip the switch. I think we're much more likely to do is to beg, borrow, and steal bit by bit parts of the ICD-11 and integrate it in gradually and slowly across time, rather than one wholesale change. That's my guess. So we will go to the ICD-11, but we have a history of being 2 generations behind the rest of the world. Don't forget, up until 2013, we were using 1974 ICD-9 codes. The rest of the world had left that behind 20 or 30 years earlier. So we've always been tremendously behind the curve. When we moved to the DSM-5 and we moved from the 9 to the 10 codes, we caught up one generation. And then the 11 came out and we're back again, a generation behind. But we will get there. It's just that, we bring up the tail of the race. That's always been the case. Okay. So let me say something about the dual diagnostic systems then, dual or dueling, because I do mean it as a double entendre. There are two of them, the ICD and the DSM, and they do duel. Again, they sleep together peaceably enough, but always with some degree of vigilance and awareness about what's happening on the other side of the bed. The ICD, of course, is much older than the DSM, and it predates it. It started when the world was lit only by fire. In the days before electricity. If you think back to the grand era that some of us can remember, or at least we have, if we didn't literally attend the World Fairs or the great exhibitions, we were aware of them. Now the world has become so much smaller ever since Al Gore invented the internet. And we have Google and we can go anywhere in an instant. But there was a time in which only periodically, once every 5 or 10 years, some country would take on itself the burden and responsibility and the glory of developing a World's Fair. A World's Fair was a place where everybody from all over the world would come and represent their culture and their wares. So for many, many, and they would build a whole city, an entire city would be built, and people would bring in all their technological advances and their culture, and the things they do, the things that distinguish them. And you could see for the first time, people from the East could meet people from the West, and indigenous people could meet non-indigenous people. And Europeans had access to people from around the globe they otherwise would never see outside of the pages of a National Geographic or something. So it was a great big world back then. Well, in 1851, one of these great exhibitions was held in London. It was called the Great Exhibition of 1851. There, created, for all practical purposes, spawned the development of the ICD, because four statisticians, European statisticians, decided that as long as you had people from all over the world convening for a long period of time, these cities oftentimes would stand for 6 months to a year, attract hundreds and hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. Let's do what statisticians do. Let's take all the different cultures around the world and let's compare them in terms of the quality of the goods they produce. Who makes the best leather goods? Is it Portugal? Is it Mexico? Is it Spain? Who makes the best textiles? Who makes the best ceramics? So they did what statisticians do. They did quantitative statistical comparisons of the quality of goods. And sure enough, they found that they could rank order countries according to the quality of their distinctive products. 4 years later, that same group met. They met in Belgium. They've met every 4 years. It's called the International Statistical Institute. They've met every 4 years since then, in the intervening century and a quarter, whatever. And they decided, they said, we had such success last time in comparing the quality of goods of people from around the world. Let's do the same thing this time, except instead of comparing the quality of goods, do people make differential quality goods from around the world? Let's compare instead what it is people die from. People die from the same thing in different countries. Well, it turns out, as you might expect, they actually do not. Very few people in the equator die, for example, from frostbite. Relatively few people in Arctic regions die from parasitic or equatorial diseases more broadly. So people die from different things in different places. And this was an epiphany in the 1850s. Nobody knew that. It was like, whoa, that began to seed what would mature and become and coalesce into what was called the original ICD. Originally, it was called the International Causes of Death. That's what it was called. ICD was International Causes of Death. But over time, it gradually increased to include diseases. And that's what we think of today, International Classification of Diseases. The ICD has been revised periodically. I'm not going to go through this in detail across time. And mostly they reconvene every 10 years to do a revision of the ICD. That comes out at different times, but the revision cycle is a 10-year revision cycle. That's not accidental, gang, because most countries, not all, but most, including the United States, have a census that's performed every 10 years. And the ICD is designed to articulate in the sense with the census. It's an epidemiological document. It was from the beginning. The endoskeleton of the ICD, very unlike the DSM, is not clinical, it's statistical. Why? It was developed by 4 statisticians. It's a statistical epidemiological document with health stuff scabbed onto it. The DSM is the exact opposite. It's a clinical diagnostic tool with statistical and epidemiological stuff scabbed onto it. The one thing that I want to call your attention to in this slide is right dead center. And that is 1948. You'll see a red line. That red line, the vertical line, is by many people, this was the introduction of the ICD-6. By many people's standing or perception, the ICD-6 was the sea change, the biggest single change in all of the ICDs. Why? Well, there are lots of reasons for it, but one of the reasons that's central to our interest today is it's the first time that they actually introduced mental and behavioral disorders. They were called mental, psychoneurotic, and personality disorders back in 1948. But before that, the ICD included only physical disorders, only health disorders. In 1948, they included the first time mental disorders. Why? Well, think about it. 1948, we're just talking about the tail end of World War II. People are being disgorged. Millions and millions of people are being disgorged from the front line of battle all over the world with every manner of psychological disorder. And they're coming back to a pre-printing press world in which there is no common nomenclature for diagnosing psychiatric disorder or distress. I know that's hard to imagine from today's standpoint, but it's true. France had 2 different systems. It had a system in Paris and it had one for France. The United States had 3 different diagnostic systems in operation in 1948. Every country, like snowflakes or fingerprints, had different diagnostics. So there was no common nomenclature or communication. So what was called one thing in one place would be called something else in another place. So it was a bad context for developing common understandings. The World Health Organization recognized that and decided to end mental and behavioral disorders. Well, the American Psychiatric Association caught wind. They got a whiff of this change. And I don't want to say they took umbrage, but they took umbrage. They didn't take umbrage. They said this. They said, look, why is the World Health Organization doing that? We are the American Psychiatric Association. We have a rightful stake in this territory. We have a voice to add. And they're right. They were, and probably to this day remain, the single most potent political, certainly, force in relation to psychiatric distress and disorder. So they felt like they could have additive value. So they quite literally went to the World Health Organization. They trundled over to Geneva. They knocked on the door. Yes, who's there? And they said, it's the American Psychiatric Association. What do you want? And they proceeded to tell them, we would like to borrow your F codes. We would like to borrow your mental and behavioral disorders. Why do you want them? Well, we want them because we feel like if you let us borrow your F codes, we will pull them out and develop a full-blown diagnostic manual based on them. We will call it the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, and we will add operationally defined criteria for diagnosing. We will add thick descriptive information like prognostic, comorbidity, sex, culture, gender, all that information. So we will be able to have a standalone psychiatric diagnostic document that is far, far, far more informative than the sort of skeletal approach that you have in the ICD. And the World Health Organization said in Spock-esque fashion, go forth and prosper. However, they had a provision. The provision was this. You can borrow our F codes, our mental and behavioral disorders. You can use them. You can nurture them. They're our children. You can nourish them. You can play with them. You can have fun with them. You can help develop them and train them. But you do not own them. We are not transferring custodial rights to you for them. We retain ownership. This is why one of the stipulations is you may never come up with a new edition of your manual, your DSM, unless it articulates with one of our new additions. So in other words, you can never scoop us. We can only scoop you. And that's exactly how it is to this day. That's why DSM-4 or DSM-3R was 3R and not 4, and why 4TR was TR and not 5. That's also why DSM-5 TR has no chance of being a DSM-6. It's not allowed to be. So just post-war, After granting them the permission to use the F codes, the American Psychiatric Association came out with the first DSM, the DSM-1. It wasn't called the one. They thought it would be the one and all only. It's kind of like Schwarzenegger's movie Terminator. It wasn't T1. It was just called Terminator. It wasn't until T2 came out that we started to talk about T1. Same thing with the DSM. It's DSM-1 came out in 1952. It was very helpful in a post-war era. Gained some degree of attention and utility that was magnified tremendously, of course, as we moved in toward later editions, particularly DSM-3, that introduced the three pillars, if you will, of the DSM. That is, that it was empirically driven, that it was atheoretical, but of course, those are no longer the case in the DSM-5 and 5TR, but they were at that time. So I'm not going to go through the revisions, but you'll recognize the DSM gets changed, unlike the ICD, on a PRN schedule, whatever it needs to be revised. And those revision cycles have been between 6 and 17 years. So it's whenever they have a stomach for it, whenever there's been significant enough changes, it's a PRN kind of revision. And that's been the case with the DSM-5TR as well. It's important to keep in mind the ICD and the DSM, although they play well together, are in fact different diagnostic systems or different psychiatric taxonomies, if you will, with different objectives and different purposes. They have different trajectories. The ICD is produced by the Global Health Agency, the World Health Organization, underneath the auspices of the United Nations. It covers everything that you could get. It covers all health conditions, physical and psychological, and it contains mortality and morbidity. Mortality, what people die from, and morbidity, what they get, the diseases. The DSM, though, is produced by one guild, one association on one continent, North America, in one country, the United States. Of course, it includes voices more broadly, but that's really where its epicenter is. It covers only mental disorders and only covers morbidity. It only covers diseases. You don't get trained in the DSM to learn what people die from. It doesn't cover mortality, only morbidity. The ICD was developed from the outset as a free resource for the public health benefit, much more statistical, much more epidemiological. The DSM, of course, as we talked about, is copyrighted and revenue generating. It's proprietary to the American Psychiatric Association. The ICD was designed for frontline service providers, and the DSM, at least initially, was developed for U.S. psychiatrists, which at that time were primarily, almost exclusively, psychoanalytic in orientation, although it broadened considerably, as you know, across time. If you go to the ICD meetings, what you'll find is they are highly global, multidisciplinary, multilingual. It's like the Tower of Babel, people speaking all different kinds of languages. You've got dietitians, nurses, physicians, psychologists, social workers, licensed mental health counselors, marriage and family therapists, nutritionists, you name it. You've got everybody on board. DSM, by comparison, has long been accused of its more limited Anglophone perspective. It's struggled, I think, to overcome that. But the truth of the matter is that in the Venn diagram of the world of psychodiagnosis, there's a great big giant circle, and that's the ICD. And there's a little circle within that, and that is the DSM. There is a diagnostic dog and there's a diagnostic tail. The ICD is the dog, the tail is the DSM. The dog wags the tail does not wag the dog. The two systems are important. I don't mean to denigrate either of them, but they are entirely different. They have different purposes, different foci of convenience. The World Health Organization's World Health Assembly approves the ICD. Every country, nearly 200 of the members, the United States is among them, has one vote for the changes in the ICD. So it's approved by the world. The DSM, as you know, convenes a set of work groups, 20-some work groups. They choose a task, a work group chair. The chair chooses the members of his or her committee. They make recommendations that go to the task force. The task force makes recommendations to the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees that makes the final decisions. So you see, it's a far more insular structure, if you will, for decision making, and that's important to keep in mind. It's built into that process. The differential inclusiveness is built into the endoskeleton of the two different diagnostic systems. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when the DSM-5 launched back in 2013, it was very much like the Roman god Janus. If you remember the Roman god Janus, he had two faces. He had one face facing back toward the past, he could see everything that once was. And at the same time, he had a second face facing toward the future, looking toward what will yet come, what will yet be. So he had this incredible omniscience, if you will, being able to see what was and what will yet become. The DSM-5 was in exactly that same position because when it launched, it needed to include, it was using the 1974, this is in 2013, 1974 ICD-9 codes. So it was, in a sense, hamstrung by the code structure from yesteryear. And it really was a code structure from yesteryear. Um, so, uh, but it needed to articulate with that. At the same time, it knew that the ICD-10 was coming down. The ICD-11 would be launching, and it was designed to articulate as best as it could with this new edition of the ICD coming out. So it decided it would play catch up and try to include the ICD-10 codes, the intermediate codes. So it had to look at one at the same time, the past and at the future. And in this slide, I'm trying to reflect that by joining the DSM-5 TR with the DSM-5. Of course, the TR is a revised version of the 5. The 5 TR is a text revision of the 5. But what's important to keep in mind is in order to get to the DSM-5 TR, what they had to do, and when they had the opportunity to do, was to drag the DSM-5 through the ICD-11, because the 11 had launched in between the 5 in 2013 and the TR in 2023, 2022. The ICD-11 had launched, so it was full form. The bun was baked. So what they did is they dragged the DSM-5 through the ICD and picked up everything that they wanted to and added it into the DSM-5 text revision, the TR. This is a little bit like if you've ever fried chicken or baked chicken, you put the breadcrumbs on a nice plate, right? And then you take your chicken and, you rinse it off and you pat it down. And then you take the chicken, you put it in the breadcrumbs and you drag it through the breadcrumbs. So you drag it through the bread, you turn it over and you drag it through the breadcrumbs. And then you kind of shake it like this and get any extra breadcrumbs off. And there you go. Then you go bake your chicken or fry your chicken. Exactly what the DSM-5 ER did. It dragged itself through the breadcrumbs of the ICD-11 and to see what would stick. And then it cooked the goose. Okay. This is the code structure of the ICD-10-CM. This is exactly what is in the DSM-5 TR at this time. You'll notice a couple things I want to call your attention to. One is that all the chapters are organized by basically topographically. So there's a chapter on infectious and parasitic diseases, on musculoskeletal, on ENT, on circulatory, respiratory, and so forth. This is only the first 10 of 21 chapters in the ICD overall. One and only one of those is chapter 5, and that's mental and behavioral disorders. Very easy to keep in mind because chapter 5 is the DSM-5. Chapter 5 is the DSM-5 TR. Quite literally, like in the crane game outside of a Walmart or a Target. What happened is the DSM goes into the ICD with its crane, and it goes down to chapter 5, mental and behavioral disorders, and it snags as many of them as it can. It brings them up and it dumps them between the covers of the DSM. That's where the DSM gets its codes from chapter 5. DSM-5 TR is the ICD-10 chapter 5. 5 is 5. 5 from ICD is 5 in DSM. So the DSM is the Adam's rib of the ICD. Well, what's in there that's new? Well, there's a lot. Let's talk about prolonged grief disorder, unspecified mood disorder, suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury, and gender dysphoria, as well as cultural variation and affirmation.
Dr. Niemeyer, may I ask a question from the chat?
Sure, of course.
There was an individual that asked, based on this information, it looks like the DSM 6 edition is a long way off. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. Because 6 can't come out. Now you could come out. I don't think anybody's going to have the stomach for it. You could come out with a DSM-5R, right? But no, we're at least the revisions for the ICD 12 won't start for a decade, and it'll take 3, 4, 5, 6 years from start to finish, just like ICD-11 did. So we're probably in the neighborhood, let's just say 15 years from a DSM-6. But it is possible that we would have an additional revision. We've never had two revisions between ICDs, but that is a possibility. Can't have a 6 until you have an ICD-12. That's a good question. Okay. So yeah, any questions anybody has at any time, happy to answer them. That's fantastic. It's literally true that the DSM is the Adams root of the ICD. Can't come up with a new edition until the ICD comes up with a new edition. And DSM-5 was designed to harmonize with the ICD-11, so the DSM-5 TR couldn't do it. That cake was baked, even though it hadn't yet been published. Prolonged grief disorder probably is the marquee player for the DSM-5 TR. It is a new addition. Keep in mind, it is not added to the depressive disorder category. It's added to the trauma and stress-related disorders. And this is the trauma and stress-related disorders. You can see it's a natural inclusion. It's the last in the category of trauma and stress-related, other stress-related disorders, prolonged grief disorder. And it's a natural fit because in truth, it is a traumatic stress disorder, but it's just a traumatic stress disorder of a certain kind. The unexpected or horrific death of someone who is close to you that triggers a protracted, prolonged, or complicated bereavement that dramatically exceeds normal processes of grieving, however variably culturally perceived that may be. And there's huge cultural variation in that regard. It's very important to keep in mind that the DSM-5 TR underscores the fact that grief itself is a natural response to the loss of a loved one. There's nothing pathological about that. For most people, the symptoms of grief decrease over time, but for a small percentage of people, and it is a small percentage, the feeling of intense grief actually persists. The symptoms are severe enough to cause problems and to stop them from continuing their lives in important ways. They quit their work, they become unproductive, they lose relationships, they get divorced, they lose their homes, their life comes to a screeching halt, and they don't overcome that grief. They're literally immobilized by the grief that they experience, that they can't, in a sense, transcend or overcome. Here are the diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief disorder. For adults, it has to occur, the symptoms have to persist for at least a year following the death of a close one. It doesn't have to be a friend, it could be a colleague, it could be a family member. For kids, it's a 6-month period of time, shorter. The development of the persistent grief response is characterized just about every day for the last month by intense yearning or longing and by preoccupation, unbidden preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased person, and at least 3 of the following 8 things nearly every day. Identity disruption, I come down to the breakfast table always set for 2, and now there's only 1. And I hardly know who I am. I scarcely know who I am anymore in her absence or in his absence. Marked sense of disbelief about the death. All of us, many of us, have that sense of denial. No, if you've ever been involved in death notification, it's not an uncommon thing for somebody to say, no, it can't be. It's possible. I just saw him at the party, or I just saw him yesterday. But usually that yields in a matter of seconds or moments, or certainly hours or days. But if you're still having that sense a year or 2 years later, that's what we're talking about. Avoidance of the reminders of the person or enshrining the person. Intense emotional pain, difficulty reintegrating into relationships and activities. Used to bowl every Thursday night. Haven't touched a bowling ball since I lost him or her. Emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, and intense loneliness, and so forth. So it's a pretty significant loss, and the phenomenology is one of disability. Shockingly, and this is an important consideration for those of you like me who've worked in the area of bereavement or loss, the way the DSM works, it does not include loss beyond human loss, the loss of friends, the loss of loved ones, the loss of family members. It does not include the loss of pets. We've all seen people who are mobilized by the loss of pets. It doesn't include loss of other things too, like the loss of ability through an accident, loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of employment, a loss of stock market loss, whatever. The truth of the matter is loss knows no allegiance to a relationship per se. But the DSM defines it pretty narrowly. What do you do if you have prolonged grief in relation to a non-family member or non-close friend? Well, you can always do an other specified prolonged grief disorder, other specified, loss of, cherished family pet or whatever it may be. So you have to go over into another specified category. It's not included in the diagnostic set itself, non-human loss. It has to have clinically significant distress or impairment. That's the case in every instance, and it can't be explained by other disorders. This is prolonged grief disorder. What's the prevalence of prolonged grief disorder? Well, we're going to find that out, aren't we? Because it's just now a newly minted diagnostic category with operationalized criteria, but we certainly can do pretty good estimates, and there's growing literature out there extrapolating what the prevalence is likely to be. If you think about it this way, there are about 2.5 million people in the United States who die each year. On average, each of us leaves behind about 5 grieving friends and family. Now, I'm not trying to say when you part this mortal coil, only 5 people will notice that you've been missing. No, I'm not saying that. I'm sure in your case, there will be legions of people who will be immobilized by your passing. But on average, for people like myself, there will be 5 people who are seriously affected. For some people, it's no one, as you well know. For some people, it's thousands of people, as you well know. But on average, each of us leaves behind 5 seriously grieving family and friends. I'm not saying people just miss you and remember you fondly and memorialize you. That's talking about significant grief. What this means is that grief visits the doorstep of about 10 million people in the United States each year, roughly, give or take. Approximately 7 to 10% of them are going to wind up suffering a prolonged grief disorder. This translates into about, again, big error bars, 1 million people per year. It's not an insignificant diagnostic category, gang. About 1 million people per year in the United States alone. Just give you an example of a recent study came out last year. I think it's really useful. This is a study where they took about 300 adults within the first year of the loss of their bereavement, the loss of a loved one. And they assessed them 2 times. They assessed them what they called wave 1 during that first year, and again, wave 2 after the passage of at least a full year. What they found is that about 10% of them met the criteria for probable grief disorder. That's what we just saw, about 7 to 10%. So they saw 10.1% met the criteria, probable prolonged grief disorder in wave 2. However, interestingly, what they looked at, and this I think is quite telling, people who met the criteria at wave 1 had a significantly increased risk of meeting the criteria at wave 2. 71% of the people who met the criteria at wave 1 met it at wave 2. Now, knowing what you know as a clinician, the importance of early intervention, knowing that 70%, 2/3, nearly 3/4 of the people who come to you meeting the criteria for a prolonged grief disorder within the first year are still going to experience that more than a year later, that tells you that it gives you the power of early intervention. Or the highest predictors, well, they were what you would expect. They were traumatic losses. They were the loss of a child. Even though you have lived your entire life with a grandparent, the passing of a grandparent is a far more expectable occurrence than the loss of a child who you may have only known in a matter of months or years. But it's so horrific and so unexpected. It's far more likely to trigger a prolonged grief disorder. Unnatural losses, kidnaps, murders, and so forth, untimely deaths like accidents, motor vehicle accidents, and so forth. And of course, there are also predictably socioeconomic indicators as well. People who don't have access to resources, lower education, lower SES tend to also have higher levels of prolonged grief disorder. If you want a quick instrument, a highly reliable, extremely valid instrument, you can go online and just Google PG-13. Of course, the first thing you're going to get is the movie rating system. But if you do PG-13 grief or PG-13 bereavement, you'll come up with this prolonged grief disorder, 13 revised. It's called 13 because there's 13 questions, and they tack perfectly along the contours of the diagnostic criteria themselves. And there's an online version that scores it for you, but score is a simple sum, so it's easy to do in 20 seconds. Manually. and it gives you an idea of whether the person is going to satisfy the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. And then the nice thing is you can administer it, a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later, and watch the symptom profile dissolve, watch things get better. You can see the symptomatic improvement, and it allows you to concentrate your therapeutic attention on those things that are more treatment resistant. So it's kind of a very useful, super efficient, effective, reliable, and valid clinical tool. So I encourage you to take a look at it, the PG13R.
Dr. Niemeyer, may I ask a question about this section? For individuals with borderline personality disorder characteristics, would that be a differential diagnosis for that type of disorder?
For prolonged grief disorder? No. The there will be challenges with differential diagnosis in relation to borderline personality disorder, including non-suicidal self-injury, but not much of an overlap really between a prolonged grief disorder and a borderline personality disorder. When you think about borderline personality, you're really thinking about, it's what the ICD incidentally calls an unstable personality disorder, which actually is a much better term because, if you think about it, what's borderline is borderline between what? That's a little confusing. Unstable tells the tale. Unstable relationships, unstable occupation, unstable life. Dark cloud is always there. A crisis is always looming. Really poor decision making, poor impulse, and so forth. So that doesn't have a lot of similarity with a prolonged grief disorder. However, if you have comorbidity, if you have a borderline personality disorder, you can understand the probable prevalence rate is much higher in a borderline personality disorder population than in a non-borderline, precisely because you're pulling the rug out from underneath a fundamentally unstable individual, and they have dependencies and attachments to a person, and then that person is taken from them unbidden. Wow. So issues of comorbidity, I think, would loom large, but conceptually there isn't a relationship between the two. The comorbidity would give me serious pause. If you had somebody who had a borderline personality disorder and then they suffered the loss of a significant other, they're looking for all the support and stability they can possibly recruit in their lives. So to lose that, suddenly their world becomes a one-legged stool or a two-legged stool. Well, you can understand that presents tons of challenges. So that's a great question. So let's turn then to look at the resurrected disorder. And this is not a new disorder per se, but it is new to the DSM-5-TR. It was inadvertently, I know this is hard to imagine, dropped from the DSM-5, and I'll tell you the story. It was in the DSM-4 and DSM-4-TR. This is the unspecified mood disorder. It's not a unipolar depression. It's not a bipolar depression. It's something betwixt and between. It's neither fish nor fowl. The reason it got dropped from DSM-5 is, if you'll remember, in DSM-5, before DSM-5, there was a category called mood disorders, and the mood disorders contained the bipolar and the unipolar disorders. Remember that? Well, in the DSM-5, they took away the category of mood disorders, and the bipolar disorders drifted up into a category of their own, followed by the depressive disorders, unipolar depressive disorders. Well, there was no common tie that binds them. They weren't in a category called mood disorders anymore. The problem is there was actually a diagnosis called an unspecified mood disorder that actually joined the two together. It wasn't a bipolar disorder. It wasn't a unipolar depression. It was an unspecified mood disorder that existed betwixt and between, in the liminal space between those two categories. But when the common tie that binds mood disorders got dropped, it got left behind. No diagnosis left behind. Well, it got left behind. So the DSM-5-TR recognized that they had orphaned this category, unspecified mood disorder, and they brought it back into the DSM-5-TR. But they didn't bring back mood disorder. They just brought back unspecified mood disorder. So where do you put it? Where do you put it, since it doesn't have a home? Where do you put unspecified mood disorder? Well, in the DSM-5, as I'll show you, they put it in two different categories. First of all, what is it? This is what they say it is. This is verbatim from the DSM-5-TR. This category applies to presentations in which symptoms characteristic of a mood disorder occur, but they do not at the time of the evaluation meet the full criteria for any of the disorders, either in the bipolar or the depressive disorder diagnostic classes, in which it is difficult to choose between an unspecified bipolar and related and an unspecified depressive disorder. In other words, it's neither fish nor fowl. What do they do with it? Well, they put it in both categories. They put the unspecified mood disorder both in the bipolar disorder section and in the depressive disorder section. So the depressive disorders in the DSM-5 include all these things. You'll recognize all of them. The highly controversial disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, major depression, all these. The last one is now unspecified mood disorder. And when you go to the bipolar category, voila, there it is again at the end. Again, unspecified mood disorder. It's only one of two disorders, to my knowledge, that are in two places in the DSM. The other one is the schizotypal personality disorder that's in the psychotic and the schizophrenic and other psychotic disorders and the personality disorders. So schizotypal lives in two places, and unspecified mood disorder lives in two places in the DSM-5 ER. Let's turn to talk about suicidal and non-suicidal self-injury. It's very important to keep in mind that in the DSM-5 and in the DSM-5 TR, in section 3, the conditions of further study, the non-officially recognized conditions of further study, they're awaiting additional research, possible inclusion in future editions. Both suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-injury are in there as full-blown disorders, but they're not yet officially recognized and they're not yet given a code. So they're not insurance reimbursable as standalone diagnoses. That was true in DSM-5. It's true in DSM-5 TR still. There's no change. However, DSM-5 TR said, look, these are important enough that even though we're not going to credential them as full-blown disorders and their own right, standalone diagnostic disorders with their own code, we are still going to grab the code out of the ICD-10-CM and let clinicians use them, that is suicidal behavior, non-suicidal self-injury, as codes to add to inform any and every other disorder. So you can have suicidal behavior accompanying borderline, somebody just mentioned, or accompanying depression, or accompanying substance abuse, or accompanying an eating disorder, or accompanying anything. It's not a standalone disorder, but it provides additional and critical clinical information that communicates something really important, high liability and high liability. So again, they're brought forward as Z, if you will, as Z codes. Their codes are brought forward, but not as officially approved standalone diagnoses. Suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-injury. Well, what are these? Suicidal behavior is just exactly as the name implies. This is from the DSM-5 TR. The category can be used for individuals who have engaged in potentially self-injurious behavior with at least some intent to die as a result of the activity. Evidence of the intent to end one's life can be explicit, or it can be inferred from the behavior of the circumstances. If somebody, for example, fires a gunshot to their head, even if they don't succeed, you can assume the intent, they don't have to specify it, was in fact a self-inflicted injury leading to death. They're trying to kill themselves. A suicide attempt may or may not result in self-injury. It doesn't have to result in self-injury, and sometimes it doesn't. The person tries to kill themselves and they don't. But if the intent is there, the intent is to kill themselves, it's suicidal behavior. If the individual is dissuaded by somebody at the last minute, they change their mind before they initiate the behavior, that doesn't apply. That's called suicidal ideation, or but it's not suicidal behavior. So this is suicidal behavior. Again, it has a code and it can be added to descriptively any or every other diagnosis. And you would want to, wouldn't you? Because you would want to communicate that concern in the records when that record was reviewed by other clinicians, for example, or allied healthcare professionals. And you would want to call attention to it. You'd want to monitor it. You'd want to have it on record as a significant concern, because it is a significant concern. Evidence of past suicidal behavior is a highly predictive factor in future suicidal behavior. What are suicide rates? How important is suicidal behavior? Well, it's hugely significant, as you well know. Globally, over 800,000 people die each year as a result of suicidal behavior. This is not suicide attempts. This is actual successful suicides. About 50,000 people kill themselves in the United States each year. Of course, that's much higher in some categories. Everybody's concerned about the youth, the 10 to 24-year-old group that has had an effect of doubling in the last decade in the number of suicides. It's, I don't want to say fashionable, but I will say it's scary if you go out there on the internet and you look at how they, adolescents in particular, can glorify suicide. And of course, all the cyberbullying and people encouraging people to kill themselves. And, we're in just a whole different world in terms of what function suicide can fulfill. Scary. A survey by the Centers for Disease Control a few years ago of 15,000 high school students found that over 7% of them had attempted suicide in the previous 12 months. Now, I don't know for a fact that wasn't true. When I went to high school, that would shock me. I mean, I think the prevalence rate was probably maybe a third or a quarter or a fifth that. So I think there has been a sea change. When you think about 7%, if you have a kid in high school, 7% of his or her peers tried to kill themselves, not thought about it, but attempted to kill themselves during the previous 12 months. That's a pretty shocking prevalence rate. What is non-suicidal self-injury? Well, non-suicidal self-injury.
Dr. Niemeyer?
Yep.
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yep.
One person asked in reference to the previous category, wouldn't these codes serve well as rule out option categories?
I'm sorry, John, as what categories?
Rule outs is what the chat says.
Well, you could see them as a rule out, but a rule out usually, what the purpose of a rule out is to disqualify like you're not going to diagnose, you're not going to diagnose somebody, for example, with ADHD that has had a brain injury, a TBI, for example, because the TBI rules out the attention deficit disorder. So when you think of rule outs, you usually think about things that exclude another diagnosis. So you're not excluding depression by noting that the person's also suicidal. You're not excluding bipolarity. Not everybody who's bipolar tries to kill themselves, but some do. So it's really more of a specifier. But in the DSM-5, as you know, they took away almost all the subtypes and they replaced them with specifiers. So specifiers has a specific meaning in the DSM-5 and 5-TR. It's kind of like the old subtypes, schizophrenia with paranoia, with catatonia. So this wouldn't be depression with suicide. It wouldn't be a specifier because there aren't two types of suicide. I mean, there aren't two types of depression with suicide and without suicide. It's an additional clinical presentation of something different, not a subversion of that thing. So it's not really a rule out and it's not really a specifier. It's an additional clarification that can be applied to anything, any of the disorders. And if you think about it, if you think about extreme, severe versions of virtually any disorder, as severity increases, so does the likelihood of suicidality. And so severe versions of many, many, many disorders, people are flirting with the idea of killing themselves, and some percentage of them attempt. And the same is true in relation to non-suicidal self-injury. It's a further clarification that's ancillary to, not part of. You might try to kill yourself, or you might injure yourself, hurt yourself with lots of different disorders for lots of different reasons. But it's not really a subtype of, there isn't like a non-suicidal self-injury subtype to ADHD or subtype to depression. But people who have enough of either of those things may think this is, I've got to silence this pain. I've got to quiet this pain in some way, shape, or form. You had another question too, John?
Yes, there was a question, and this goes back to unspecified mood disorders. You mentioned that unspecified mood disorders are both under depression and bipolar. Do both mentions contain the same presentation for criteria?
Yep, exactly. It's the exact same thing. It just appears in two places. And don't forget, it's an additive. It's on top of, there still is an unspecified bipolar, and there's still an unspecified unipolar depression. and there's an unspecified mood when you can't decide whether it's a bipolar or a unipolar. So in a sense, it's a third unspecified. There's an unspecified bipolar, an unspecified depression, and an unspecified mood that trumps both of those, if that makes sense. An umbrella term. Like I can't figure out, I don't know if this is bipolar or if it's unipolar. I'll know, give me a few months because the bipolarity ramifies across time. If I'm taking a snapshot, it's not always easy to see. It's why in the old days, manic depressive psychosis was misdiagnosed 9 times before it was successfully diagnosed, because people would come in a manic phase and they'd be diagnosed as schizophrenic. They'd come in a depressive phase and they'd be diagnosed as depressed and given a tricyclic, which trips a manic episode. So the bipolarity is a tough thing to sort out on a cross-sectional basis. You almost need to see it across time when you're trying to diagnose it for the first time. So the mood disorder just gives you more diagnostic wiggle room, and it doesn't force you to prematurely choose between bipolar and unipolar. You can hang out there in the unspecified mood and then look to see whether it remains chronically depressive or whether you start to see the agitation that typically attends the onset of a manic episode, and then you switch over to the bipolar. That's a great question. Okay, so let's turn to look then at the non-suicidal self-injury. And this is a category that's used for people who do intentionally inflict damage to their own body. They're not trying in any way, shape, or form to kill themselves. There is zero suicidal intent, but they engage in things like bruising. They could do cutting, burning, stabbing, twisting, but again, any of those behaviors, they are definitely designed to inflict damage, but they definitely are not designed to take your life. They are far more common, non-suicidal self-behavior injury, than suicidal behavior itself, in part because there are many more ways to injure yourself than there are to kill yourself. They're more diverse, generally less lethal forms of, you don't see people engaging in non-suicidal self-injury with a gunshot, for example, but you do see it with razor blades or with cigarettes. They tend to have much less severe medical outcomes, and for that reason, they wind up showing up less. They're more beneath the waterline. They show up less in ER, for example, simply because they can go undercover. Again, no suicidal intent. They are nonetheless strong predictors of suicidal behavior, and they are significant sources of concern. Well, why would somebody inflict injury on themselves? Well, it's like everything else in psychology and psychiatry. The manifest can have many latent underlying causes and purposes and functions. But if you think about it, here are a few of them for non-suicidal self-injury. One is affect regulation or reduction of pain. And I remember a client some years ago, eating disorder client, who burned herself. She would burn herself and she would burn herself with a lit cigarette. Well, one of the interesting things is she didn't smoke. So she was a non-smoker. What she'd do is she would light a cigarette, she'd get it glowing, and then she would, roll up her shirt sleeve, and she would take on her wrist and she would just go for like 4 or 5 seconds. And I asked her, what does that do for you? Why do you do that? Or what does it do for you what happens when you do that? And she said that, he said, I am in so much pain. I mean, my family, my mother, my father, my boyfriend, school, my peers. I mean, I got so much anxiety, so much hurt, so much bullying, so much pain. Everywhere I turn is just a giant cauldron of pain. And when I light that cigarette and it gets glowing and I take it and I apply it to my wrist, all of a sudden, all that pain out there in the world gets consolidated down into one physical pinpoint. And for just those few seconds, all of this goes away. And all I feel is this pain. And it feels so good. It feels so, so good until I remove it. And then it all comes back. But the nature of positive reinforcement, right? When something feels good and it removes the aversive stimuli associated with it, it increases the future probability of engaging in the same behavior. So if it brings you that quiescence, if it brings you that quietness, it brings you that sense of serenity, then it's more likely to be engaged in the future. And that's exactly what she was doing. So she was doing it to consolidate as a method of affect regulation to take away all this pain in her life. Of course, you can do it as self-punishment. I deserve it. You've heard clients say that. I hate myself. I loathe myself. I've got nothing. I'm an unlovable human. I deserve to be punished. And now this is a way of punishment. Sometimes it's a way to influence people. That is, look at me. Look at how much I'm hurting. Can't you see I'm hurting? Come rescue me. It can be an anti-dissociation objective. That is, the only time I feel real is when I'm cutting myself. The only time I feel like I'm a robot, I'm an automaton, I have no feelings, I don't exist in this world, except in that moment when I cut, or burn, or twist, or tear. It can be anti-suicide. Sometimes people will talk about cutting themselves so they don't kill themselves. It's a way of inflicting pain without risking taking my life. Otherwise I'd kill myself. I've had clients say that. If I didn't do this, I'd kill myself. So they're trying to prevent something worse. And then sometimes, and I add this in, but I add it in with qualification, thrill seeking. Because I don't want in any way, shape, or form diminish any of the other ones, which are very severe, by saying that these people are quote unquote thrill seeking. 99% of the time that's not true. But there is this thing of flirting with the illicit, flirting with punishment, flirting. It's like thrill seekers who put themselves in highly dangerous situations. They don't actually want to die. It's not a suicidal intent, but they're engaging in these high risky behaviors because it gives them a thrill. It's not suicidal intent. It's not suicidal behavior, but it does sometimes result in suicide. Well, you can get the same thing with non-suicidal self-injury, the thrill of coming close, thrill of drawing blood, the thrill of burning and inflicting injury gives you that endorphin rush, if you will. But again, I say this with qualification because my experience is, this is not a joke. People are not doing this as, by and large for thrill seeking. That's an ancillary consideration, I think. Okay, so I want to show you a video, and I want you to take a look at this. It's a little 2-minute, 3-minute clip of a woman, Cornyn, who came in with actually a different presenting disorder, as you'll see, which is around eating disorder. But it shows her talking about her self-injury. And I just want you, and we'll come back and do a poll, to ask yourself whether or not you as a clinician would code this as an instance of non-suicidal self-injury. Would you or would you not code her presenting problem with the ancillary consideration of a non-suicidal self-injury? So let's go ahead and start that if we can, John.
And tackle the underlying problem, because chances are, if you're picking at your skin or whatever you're doing, if you're picking at your hair, there is probably an underlying issue.
And you mentioned that, it's not the only thing you do. Have you also been picking at skin? Do you also?
Yeah. I mean, I pick at my face sometimes, but not excessively. I claw at my arms.
You claw at your arms?
Yeah.
Like to scratch them?
I scratch at my skin a lot. It's another anxiety thing. I used to do it in my sleep, but now I do it during anxiety attacks. It's a form of self-harm. And
it feels like you're doing it to hurt yourself?
Yeah.
When you do that, what does that do for you?
It's like a punishing mechanism. It's not something I'm proud of doing, or something I want to do, and it's something I've had to strongly talk myself out of a couple of times, and I have. So.
And are there other things like cutting or burning?
No, I've never cut myself or burned myself, but I have thought about it. But I've never like done it.
Just more the scratching.
Yeah.
And the hair pulling.
Yeah.
And any scab picking or anything like that?
No, just the thing on my face with the acne and the hair. Because I have PCOS, I do have abnormal hair growth on my chin and stuff. So I pick at the hair on my chin when that grows in, and my mom gets very annoyed at that. But and that sometimes will open wounds. I'll pick that so much. So, but I've been doing that less too. That was also kind of an anxiety thing.
So you see all these kind of picking things and pulling things is related to an underlying anxiety. And when that gets addressed, some of these other kind of behavioral or impulse control things get knocked down.
Yeah. I think the repetitive motions and stuff is kind of like relieves the anxiety.
We can launch the poll. What do you think here, guys? I mean, do you think? Yes, this is an example of non-suicidal self-injury. She talks about it in terms of punishment. Or B, well, maybe it is. I mean, her self-injurious behaviors seem pretty anxiety related, so it's not clear whether they're intended as self-harm. C, probably not. They're probably not non-suicidal self-injury. They seem secondary to anxiety disorders like excoriation or trichotillomania. He specifically denies any clear instances of self-harm like burning or cutting, or definitely not. Either they're ego dystonic, they lack injurious intent, they respond to anti-anxiety medicines, they're better accounted for by obsessive compulsive and other related disorders. So what do you think? What would be your take? If you're a clinician, of course, you're never going to do a coding based on a 2-minute behavior sample, but just for the sake of heuristics, and try this out, would you put a non-suicidal self-injury code in her chart to clarify this as an instance of her trying to injure herself? A, B, C, or D? What do you think? See, people are putting response. There's the poll. Okay. I'll give you a minute and think about it. Of course, these things don't have clear cut. And I chose this specifically because it doesn't have a clear cut, as many clinical presentations don't answer. The majority of what we do exists in pretty murky territory, and it's tough to tease out and sort out. And here you probably have 3 or 4 questions you would love to ask her to get further clarification, as any good clinician would do. I've thought of several things I wish at that moment I had asked her that would have been more definitive and clarifying. But this is the murky territory in which we live. And now, the session is done, and I gotta ask myself, gosh, do I add in a non-suicidal self-injury code for her, or do I let this go? Or is it pretty clear that it's not an instance of self-injury? Pretty clear it is. Pretty unclear whether it is. See what you think.
Dr. Niemeyer, we had 12% answer letter A. We had 15% answer letter B and letter C. And then 1% answered letter D.
Okay. Okay, good. Very helpful. So again, sort of normally distributed, and most of you living in the territory with me of being relatively murky, and it is murky. I mean, on the one hand, there are clear things that you could focus on where she says this is a form of self-punishment. Okay, well, I got to take her at her word. She couldn't clearly articulate the function, but it was like, yeah, I do it to punish myself. So that's a pretty high, that nominates things pretty highly. But other clearer instances, on the one hand, she thought about burning, cutting. On the other hand, she discounted. So my alarm level's going down a little bit. And also, it's very clearly, she characterizes it as anxiety related. When the anxiety goes up, these things increase more. And some of them, trichotillomania and the excoriation or picking, those by definition would be rule outs, right? Like you're not going to diagnose somebody who comes to you with trichotillomania as engaging in a non-suicidal self-injury. They're not trying to injure themselves. They're obsessively and compulsively picking at their skin, at a scab, or at their hair. So that's a rule out. That would not qualify. So what's the best answer? Well, the best answer is that you use your clinical judgment and you monitor it across time. Every one of us would see those behaviors, and it would call our attention to paying attention to them. And we probably would say, this is something I got to keep an eye on, whether I'm going to add it in as a code now or get clarification in the next session. It's not lost on me. And so for me, I'm probably fairly conservative. And what I might do in this instance is I might say, well, gosh, presenting problem is anxiety related. She talks about obsessive compulsive stuff. It wouldn't be unreasonable to see if I could knock down the anxiety symptoms, and if we could successfully address the anxiety, to see whether the non-suicidal self-injury persists. If it also goes away, then I would see it as secondary to, and no harm, no foul. On the other hand, if it persists, it's probably worth standalone treatment or attention. So not at all unreasonable. Certainly, if you're in that BC category, I'm not super definitive in terms of yes or super definitive in terms of no, but welcome to the world of clinical practice, right? So this just gives you an illustration. I just literally wanted to give you that example. And I think, John, you're probably going to need to return to me host abilities, because I can't seem to advance my slides here, or simply advance it for me. It'd be great. Okay, there we go. So, so let me say a word then about the racial and cultural. Oh, and somebody in the chat while we were doing the poll had a good point, and that is, don't you engage in non-suicidal self-injury, sometimes for self-soothing? And absolutely, that let me underscore that. That's probably the number one reason. When I was alluding to the example of the woman I had who came in with an eating disorder and was consolidating her pain with a cigarette, that really was an act of affect regulation. And the affect regulation is just a fancy way of saying self-soothing. You're trying to take all that pain and figure out some way of managing it and dealing with it and soothing yourself. So it seems weird that injury would be soothing, but hey, if you're in clinical practice, that's your everyday world. You see it all the time. People who do injurious things to soothe themselves. Doesn't have to be burning, doesn't have to be cutting, could be chemical. They do injurious things that are substance related. They're killing themselves, but they're doing it to quiet the voices, or they're doing it to eliminate the pain. They're doing it to self-soothe or self-manage. So probably that whole category of self-soothing is the single biggest reason for engaging in non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. Okay, so let's talk a bit about what I see to be maybe the biggest change, the greatest legacy, if you will, of the DSM-5 TR, and that is the attempt to reduce racial and cultural bias in the DSM, which has always been a subject of concern within the diagnostic manual. What has the DSM-5 TR done? Well, it's done a number of things, and these are not definitive, and I think these are part of these represent incremental but significant incremental changes. For one thing, they've done away with the term race altogether. They've replaced it with the term racialized. They did that in order to call out attention to the fact that race is a socially constructed variable. And so it's a racialized, not a racial designation. The term ethno-racial is used to refer to categories like Hispanic, white, African American, and so forth. They're not races, they're ethno-racial considerations or categories. The term minority and non-white obviously have been completely replaced, because they really other people, they out people, they imply that whiteness is the priority, whiteness is the centerpiece, and everything from that point on is marginalized. So the epicenter of the world is in fact not white. So the terms minority and non-white are not used. The term Caucasian, which of course should have been disgorged a couple of generations ago, has finally been disgorged from the DSM. The term is based obviously on an erroneous view about the geographic origins of people who are called white. They are not, Caucasian, and that term has been eliminated. Now, some other terms there is controversy. They do use in the DSM-5 the term Latinx instead of Latino and Latina. This is to some extent controversial. They took, I think, a bold and relatively liberal stance. As you well know, it's not universally shared to make the move toward Latinx. When Sarah Huckabee Sanders took over as the governor of Arkansas, her very first executive order, as you know, was to outlaw the use of the term Latinx. Can't be used in any governmental meetings, can't appear in any governmental papers in the state of Arkansas. I might have seen many more significant challenges for her to attend to in the state of Arkansas, but she saw that as priority one, expunge Latinx, and so she has done that because political reasons. She sees that as pandering to a woke culture, so she didn't want to do that. So it does generate some controversy. The DSM did step into that controversy and decide to use what they regard as the more inclusive term. But there, it's the jury is out in relation to that, and there's even cohort differences in the preferred designation, Latinx or Latino. But these are examples of wording does make a difference, and it is differentially inclusive or exclusive, and the DSM is trying to locate itself in space that's maximally affirming. Whether it succeeds or not, I think it's an attempt, at least. The other thing I'll mention is in terms of cultural affirmation is that they convened two committees in the DSM-5TR. One was an ethno-racial committee, and another was basically designed, a smaller committee of only 10 international experts, was really designed as what we might call a DEI committee. And these two committees were cross-cutting committees. And what they did on the first one, the Committee on Culture and Ethnicity, what they did is they read every single word in the DSM-5, every single word and every criteria set. And what they did is they looked to infuse any and every category they could with the latest and greatest information about cultural variation. And they tried to destigmatize presentations and maximize cultural inclusiveness. Let me just give you an example. There are scores of these, but just so you get a sense of it. In the DSM-5, and as in its predecessors, there was an allusion to higher levels of substance abuse, particularly alcoholism, among indigenous Native American populations. Well, that committee looked at that and they said that is a stereotypic, culturally offensive generalization. The truth of the matter is there are hundreds of tribes in the United States, and the use of substance in general and alcohol in particular vary tremendously. The Lakota Sioux and the Cherokee are on entirely different ends of the dimension of substance use and alcohol abuse. So it's not fair to tar all indigenous peoples with one designation. So there's language then that reflects that. In other words, it articulates what we do know, and it articulates the boundaries of our knowledge, which is an important, rather than assuming it applies to all indigenous individuals, that there's evidence that higher levels of X, Y, and Z substance are present in this subpopulation, and unknown prevalence rates in other areas. So that's just an example. The other category, the DEI category, the smaller group of 10 largely cultural psychiatrists, I guess you call them, they really went through and they looked at issues of health equity and discrimination. They wanted to make sure that that there was due attention in the language, that there wasn't inadvertently discriminatory or offensive in any way, shape, or form. But they too read every single word of every different criteria set and tried to destigmatize. And if you just put on a DEI lens, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness lens, and you read the DSM cover to cover with that set, through those lenses, that's what they did. So those two groups spent 3 years making those culturally focused changes, and they made, I think that they're significant, even in gender dysphoria. Significant changes. No longer use the term natal birth, for example. It's assigned at birth, male assigned at birth, female assigned at birth, and so forth. So they tried to change a lot of vernacular to be more inclusive and affirming. So again, I think as we look back at the DSM-5, we're going to see its attempt to move very different than what the DSM-4 did when they added in its culture-bound syndromes, which cut both ways. I mean, on the one hand, it brought attention to culture. On the other hand, it marginalized these quaint Aboriginal presentations of pathology like Coro. And incidentally, there were and are no culture-bound syndromes that are Western. There are only these exotic indigenous ones, primarily Latina or Asian. So they were very, very controversial. That's in a sense the opposite of what they're trying to do this time around. They're trying to be much more inclusive, much more sensitive, much more culturally affirming. So I think there's they've taken a dramatic turn, in my view, in the right direction. With the DSM-5TR, it's a work in progress. And it's very fair for people to say the glass is definitely half empty and not half full. But I think the movement in the direction is is quite clear, and perhaps it represents a pathway that subsequent versions of the DSM will continue to trot along as they move forward. Let me just say in conclusion, then, the last couple of things about the future, and that is, in the immortal words of Buzz Lightyear, to infinity and beyond. Now that we are where we are, where do we head to next, both for the ICD and the DSM? Well, it's pretty clear in relation to both documents what's happening. I mean, the DSM-5 TR, is in its first year, and it's at the point of trying to do market penetration and train people up. So the foreseeable future for the DSM-5 is going to be to get the DSM-5 TR out there and make people aware of the changes and revisions. At the same time, keeping a very close eye on the adoption of the ICD-11 globally and changes that are likely to unfold as the 11 blends into its own revision in the future, the ICD-12. What's happening with the ICD? Well, the ICD 11 is launched. It's also in an adoption phase. Every one of the nearly 200 member countries, including the United States, have established timelines or are establishing timelines for adoption. So they're very, very much interested in enhancing market share, if you will, trying to get people on board with the very substantial changes associated with the ICD-11. And then there's the changes in relation to the two of them. Both groups, the World Health Organization and the American Psychiatric Association, are under, if you will, self-imposed dicta to harmonize with one another. And so what they say when it comes to the revision is both of them expressly say, if we make a change that the other guy's not making, if we choose to diverge rather than converge, we have to explain why we are diverging, why we are taking path less followed. So the assumption is going to be harmonization, that they agree, and any divergence, it's kind of like in a Supreme Court decision. If you have a dissenting opinion, you've got to articulate what it is. You may be the loser, but you've got to articulate that difference. And that's the case here. So the assumption is that they will harmonize in the future and agree. In any and every instance in which they disagree, they have to articulate the rationale undergirding it. But remember, they're different documents. They have different purposes. They have different objectives. So there are good reasons for them not to agree with one another. A great case in point, maybe it's the marquee version, is internet gaming addiction. As you know, the DSM-5 included the first behavioral addiction, gambling, but it did not include, except in the conditions of further study, online gaming. DSM-5 TR also does not include online gaming. It's only in the conditions of further study. They did not bring it up. They did bring up prolonged grief disorder. Don't forget, a version of prolonged grief disorder was in the DSM-5 conditions of further study. It was called complicated bereavement. But the DSM-5 brought that up with a new name, prolonged grief disorder. Incidentally, and not accidentally, the name DSM-5 used for the disorder is the ICD's name, not their own name. They didn't bring, DSM-5 TR did not bring up complicated bereavement, which is in its own manual and conditions of further study. They went over to the ICD and grabbed the ICD's name, prolonged grief disorder. Why? Because that is included in ICD-11. And when they dragged the chicken thigh through the ICD-11, the breadcrumbs that stuck to it included the use of prolonged grief disorder. It did not include online gaming. And the reason for that is very simple. From the World Health Organization standpoint, largely an epidemiological document, the ICD, everybody's dealing with online gaming. And it's a very, 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 very serious and extraordinarily high prevalence disorder. I'm not saying all disorder, I'm saying the addictive version, whether it's first-person shooters or Candy Crush. There's significant problems associated with some percentage of online gaming. He sees that. And particularly, a number of big ones, of course, are Japan and China and Korea. So ICD did officially recognize online gaming. It's a disorder, it has its own code, has an ICD-11 code. DSM-5-TR does not use the ICD-11, so it doesn't have the ICD-11 codes. So there is no officially recognized online gaming in the DSM, only in the ICD. But it makes sense because the ICD is an epidemiological global document. The DSM is a clinical document, and they are more conservative. And they said, well, we don't yet have enough research. We need more research to develop the actual criteria to define this disorder. And they pen those research criteria and they put them in the DSM-5-TR under conditions of further study. So it is in the works to be adopted, but the ICD can do in the bat of an eyelash what the DSM takes a generation to do. So that's an example of where the two documents diverge, but they diverge because they have different objectives and rationale. One is a public health epidemiological, and the other is a clinical diagnostic. People always ask, and I will conclude with this, why do you have two diagnostic systems? Why don't we just do away with the DSM and go with the ICD? Well, let me say this about that. It's a good question. However, the very thing that distinguished the DSM from the ICD from the outset still distinguishes it today. The DSM is a clinical and diagnostic document. It has operationalized criteria for diagnosing each and every one of its 400 different disorders. The ICD has none of that. The DSM has all the prognostic and comorbidity and sex, role, gender information. The ICD has none of that and never will, because if you put all of that in to every condition, physical and psychological, you're going to have to bring the ICD out on a hand truck, on a dolly. So the DSM is distinctive today in relation to those things that animated its development back in the 1950s. So I do not see the DSM, I don't see the ICD toppling over in Malcolm Gladwell's terms and reaching a tipping point and crushing the DSM. I think they will continue to do turf wars for market space, but likely they are going to continue across time because they fulfill somewhat distinctive objectives in relation to the space of psychiatric diagnosis. So I hope these comments are useful to you in relation to understanding some of the changes in the DSM-5-TR and the way in which they articulate with the World Health Organization's ICD. Happy to address any questions or comments that people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niemeyer. I have pulled a couple of questions from the chat. One individual asked if complex post-traumatic stress was included in the text revision of the DSM-5.
Fantastic question, and the answer is no. And this is another example. In fact, this is even a better example than online gaming of where the two systems diverged. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is included in the ICD-11. It is not included in the DSM-5-TR. The reason for that, the short version of the reason for that, is that the DSM feels as if about 94%, there's about a 94% overlap, give or take a percentage of two, between complex and regular PTSD. DSM argues that there isn't sufficient evidence about the distinctiveness of complex post-traumatic stress disorder to make it a standalone category, and the treatment regimens for them would be identical, that is regular PTSD and complex. ICD makes the exact opposite. It says, no, they are qualitatively distinct. We don't yet have as much literature and research as we would like on it, but all the ritualistic abuse, okay, the childhood sexual abuse across time, the kidnapping and serial molestation, all of those relational ruptures that accompany a complex PTSD, very different than surviving an earthquake or surviving a car wreck, for example. They are fully warranting the designation of complex, and they do call for different treatment regimens. So here's one of the two different diagnostic groups. The World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association simply agree to disagree. What's going to happen over time? Well, they're going to harmonize. And again, I'm not Greg Nostradamus Niemeyer, but there is a dog and there is a tail, and the dog wags the tail doesn't wag the dog. You're not going to see the ICD dropping complex PTSD. I think you're far more likely to see DSM adopted.
Thank you so much. One person wanted to know if dermatillomania is a form of self-injury.
No, more of a, I mean, there may be aspects of it that would warrant, sort of, subcoding it, but it's going to present more likely to present as a standalone disorder and deserve a code of its own. And it's going to be under an obsessive compulsive and other related disorders. Because again, self-injury is not an insurance reimbursable standalone disorder. You're really talking about an obsessive compulsive and other related disorder. And you put that under there, obsessive compulsive and other related, other specified dermatilia, because it deserves its own exclusive attention. It is what you're treating. And it is a standalone diagnosis. It's a good question.
Perfect. And the last one I'll ask before we wrap it up. One person wanted to know what your opinion is on the developmental trauma disorder that certain individuals wanted to place in the DSM-5.
Yeah, that's developmental trauma. That's a huge, I mean, it's a fantastic question, and it's a really important area. I will say that I'm more in the loss from the DSM-5 forward. I'm more in the loss of Chapter 1. Chapter 1 has always been disorders of infancy, adolescence, and early adulthood, and it really gave a developmental focus to the DSM, recognizing that stuff happens developmentally that are really, really important and distinctive. That's lost in the DSM-5 moving forward. There is no Chapter 1 on infancy, childhood, and early adolescence. So the developmental disorders in general suffer. So there's going to be no chance of adding developmental trauma. However, many of the complex PTSDs are developmental traumas. They're kids who have been sexually, physically, emotionally abused across time. They occur developmentally. So I think if the DSM has a chance to wrap in a complex a trauma disorder like the ICD has already led the way to do, and I think that's a matter of just time. It's a when and not an if. Then I think they're going to be able to reclaim some of that developmental trauma space. Because guys, look at the literature on the aversive childhood consequences. I mean, look at all of that literature on bad stuff that happens during childhood and the way in which it ramifies on physical and psychological health moving forward. We know the critical role of developmental trauma. We know it. So we have to be able to diagnostically account for it. I think we will be able to do a much better job of that as we move toward identifying and embracing and affirming the inclusion of a complex PTSD.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niemeyer.